The summer of 1878 had been brutal to Colorado Territory, with drought turning the grasslands to tinder and tensions between white settlers and the northern Cheyenne reaching a breaking point. Samuel Crawford stood on the porch of his remote ranch, watching dust devils dance across the parched earth while the sun beat down mercilessly from a cloudless sky. At 41, he had carved this homestead from the wilderness with his own hands, building a modest but solid life for himself and his late wife Margaret in one of the most dangerous corners of the frontier. Samuel was a man shaped by hardship and loss, his weathered face telling the story of countless days under the unforgiving western sun. His hands bore the calluses of honest labor, ranch work, farming, the endless tasks required to survive in a land that offered no mercy to the weak or unprepared. The photograph on his mantelpiece showed him standing beside a woman with gentle eyes and a kind smile. Margaret, taken by fever 2 springs past, leaving him alone on this isolated spread with nothing but memories and the cattle that grazed his sparse pastures. The ranch itself sat in a valley between 2 low hills, strategically positioned near a reliable water source that had drawn both settlers and Indians to the area for generations. Samuel had built his house and outbuildings with defense in mind: thick log walls, narrow windows, clear fields of fire in all directions. He had learned during his years as a cavalry scout that preparation often meant the difference between life and death on the frontier. But today felt different. There was a tension in the air that had nothing to do with the weather, a sense that something was building toward an explosion that would leave blood on the ground and families mourning their dead. Samuel had been expecting trouble ever since word came down from Denver that the government was planning to force the Cheyenne onto reservations in Indian Territory, far from their ancestral lands and sacred sites. It was late afternoon when Captain Morrison arrived with his patrol of 30 soldiers, their blue uniforms dark with sweat and dust from the long ride. Samuel knew Morrison by reputation, a career officer who had served with distinction during the Civil War, but who had developed a particular reputation for harsh treatment of hostile Indians after losing his eldest son in a raid near the Kansas border. "Crawford," Morrison said as he dismounted, his voice carrying the crisp authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. "We need to water our horses and get information about Indian movement in this area." Samuel nodded, gesturing toward the well near his barn. "Water's free, Captain. What kind of information are you looking for?" Morrison's eyes were hard as winter ice as he surveyed the empty landscape. "There's been trouble east of here. A Cheyenne war party hit a wagon train near Pueblo Creek, killed everyone including women and children. We're tracking them, and their trail leads through this valley." Samuel felt his stomach tighten with unease. He had heard nothing of any wagon train attack, and in his experience, stories of Indian raids often grew in the telling, sometimes sprouting from thin air when someone needed an excuse for violence. "How do you know it was Cheyenne?" he asked carefully. Morrison's face flushed with barely controlled anger. "Because we found arrows, and because we know their methods. Don't question military intelligence, Crawford. I know you've had dealings with the savages in the past, but this time they've crossed a line that can't be uncrossed." As the soldiers watered their horses and rested in whatever shade they could find, Samuel listened to their talk and felt his unease growing. The men were angry, frustrated by months of chasing shadows across impossible terrain, looking for someone to blame for all the hardships and fears of frontier military service. They spoke of the supposed wagon train massacre in graphic detail, working themselves into the kind of righteous fury that often led to the slaughter of innocent people. "We know they're headed for the winter camps in the high country," Morrison said as he prepared to continue the pursuit. "But if any of them come through here, if you see so much as a single feather or moccasin print, you send word immediately. Anyone caught aiding hostile Indians will be treated as an enemy of the United States, Crawford. I hope that's clear." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire, but Samuel simply nodded. After the soldiers rode away, he stood in the gathering dusk and wondered what fresh hell was about to be unleashed on this already troubled land. The answer came just before dawn. Samuel was awakened by the desperate neighing of horses in distress, a sound that brought him instantly alert, with the reflexes of a man who had learned to sleep lightly on dangerous ground. He grabbed his rifle and moved to the window, peering out into the grey pre-dawn light to see a lone rider approaching his ranch at a dead run, pursued by what looked like several soldiers firing from horseback. The rider was a young Indian woman, perhaps 17 or 18 years old, mounted on a paint pony that was clearly exhausted from a long, hard chase. She wore traditional Cheyenne clothing decorated with intricate beadwork, but Samuel could see that her dress was torn and stained with what looked suspiciously like blood. Her long black hair streamed behind her as she rode, and even from a distance he could see the desperation in her posture. Behind her, 3 soldiers were gaining ground rapidly, their cavalry mounts fresh and strong compared to her worn-out pony. Samuel could see rifle muzzles flashing as they fired, though at this distance and speed their shots were unlikely to hit anything vital. But it was clear that they intended to run her down and finish whatever they had started. Without conscious thought, Samuel found himself moving toward his own horse, saddling the big roan gelding with practiced efficiency, while his mind raced through the implications of what he was about to do. Interfering with a military operation was treason, punishable by death. But watching a young woman be hunted down like an animal was something his conscience simply wouldn't allow. The girl's pony stumbled as Samuel rode out to intercept the chase, nearly going down before recovering its footing. The delay was enough for the soldiers to close the distance significantly, and Samuel could see the girl looking back over her shoulder with stark terror in her dark eyes. Samuel spurred his horse into a gallop, angling to place himself between the girl and her pursuers. As he drew closer, he could see that she was indeed wounded. A bullet grazed along her left shoulder that had bled through the bandage she had improvised from strips of her dress. "This way!" Samuel shouted, gesturing toward his ranch house. "Follow me!" The girl looked at him with a mixture of hope and confusion, clearly not understanding his words, but recognizing the offer of help. She turned her failing pony toward his ranch, and together they raced across the open ground while bullets whined overhead. They reached the ranch house just ahead of the pursuing soldiers, and Samuel quickly helped the girl dismount and get inside while he prepared to face the consequences of his actions. The soldiers pulled up in his yard, their faces flushed with anger and exertion. "Crawford!" shouted the sergeant leading the patrol. "That was a hostile Indian you just aided. Hand her over immediately, or you'll face charges of treason." Samuel stepped onto his porch, his rifle held casually, but ready. "That was a wounded girl being chased by grown men with guns, Sergeant. Last I checked, that wasn't military procedure." "She's a prisoner who escaped from a lawful detention," the sergeant snarled. "We have orders to bring her back, dead or alive." "Whose orders?" Samuel asked. "And what was she being detained for?" The sergeant's hesitation told Samuel everything he needed to know. This wasn't an official military operation. It was something else entirely, probably connected to Morrison's obsession with finding someone to blame for the supposed wagon train attack. "That's not your concern, Crawford. Just hand her over, and we'll forget this interference happened." Samuel looked at the 3 soldiers, noting their nervous energy and the way they kept glancing at each other. These weren't hardened cavalry veterans following legitimate orders. They were young men who had gotten in over their heads and were now desperately trying to cover their tracks. "I'm afraid I can't do that, boys," Samuel said quietly. "The girl's wounded and on my property. Until I know what this is really about, she stays here." For the standoff lasted for nearly an hour, with the soldiers threatening and Samuel remaining calmly immovable. Finally, faced with the prospect of killing a white rancher to get to one Indian girl, the patrol reluctantly withdrew. But Samuel knew this was far from over. They would be back with reinforcements and official authorization. Inside the house, the girl had collapsed onto his kitchen floor, her face pale from blood loss and exhaustion. Samuel quickly gathered his medical supplies and knelt beside her, speaking in the gentle tone he had once used with wounded horses. "Easy there," he said softly. "I'm going to look at that wound, make sure it's not worse than it looks." She watched him with wary, dark eyes as he carefully examined her injured shoulder. The bullet had ploughed a furrow through the flesh without hitting anything vital, but it needed proper cleaning and bandaging to prevent infection. As he worked, she began to speak in a mixture of English and Cheyenne, her voice soft but urgent. Samuel caught enough words to piece together her story, and what he learned made his blood run cold. Her name was Ayana, which meant eternal blossom in her language. She was the daughter of a war chief named Black Hawk, and their band had been camped peacefully near a stream about 15 miles northeast when Morrison's patrol had attacked without warning just before dawn. There had been no negotiation, no attempt to determine whether the camp was hostile, just sudden, overwhelming violence that had left dozens of her people dead or dying. "My father," she said in halting English, tears streaming down her face. "He fight to let others escape, but soldiers, they shoot everything that move, children, old ones, even dogs." Samuel felt a familiar cold rage building in his chest, the same fury he had felt during the war, when he witnessed unnecessary cruelty and violence. This wasn't a military action against hostile warriors. This was a massacre of innocent people, the kind of atrocity that would be covered up and forgotten while newspapers celebrated another victory against the savage Indians. "How did you get away?" he asked gently. Ayana touched her wounded shoulder. "Soldier shoot, think I dead. I play dead until they go, then take horse and run. Father tell me before, if big trouble come, ride to Crawford Ranch, find Samuel who help people who need help." Samuel was surprised to learn that Black Hawk knew him by name, though he supposed his reputation for fairness and honesty had spread further among the local tribes than he realized. Now that reputation was about to be put to the ultimate test. "They followed you here," he said. It wasn't a question. She nodded miserably. 3 soldiers. They hunt me like animal for 2 days. I think they want to kill. Make sure no one tell what really happened at camp." Of course. Morrison had probably ordered the attack on his own authority, using the dubious story of the wagon train massacre as justification. Now he needed to eliminate any witnesses who could expose what had really happened. The slaughter of peaceful Indians who had nothing to do with any raids. Samuel spent the rest of the day caring for Ayana's wounds and listening to her story. She was clearly intelligent and educated, speaking better English than many white settlers he had known. Her father had apparently sent her to a mission school for several years, believing that understanding white ways would help their people survive in a changing world. But survival was looking increasingly unlikely. Morrison would return with overwhelming force, and when he did, both Samuel and Ayana would probably end up dead. The only question was whether Samuel could get her to safety before the hammer fell. As evening approached, Samuel began to see flickering lights in the distance, not the harsh glare of lanterns or torches, but the warm, dancing flames of campfires. Lots of them, arranged in what looked like a huge circle around his ranch. He grabbed his rifle and moved cautiously to the window, his heart pounding as he tried to count the fires. There had to be at least 50 of them, maybe more, creating a ring of light that stretched for hundreds of yards in every direction. As he watched, more fires appeared until his entire ranch was surrounded by a constellation of flickering flames. "Ayana," he called softly, "come look at this." She joined him at the window, and Samuel saw her face transform with wonder and relief as she took in the sight before them. "My people," she whispered, "they come." As they watched, figures began to emerge from the darkness beyond the fires. Cheyenne warriors on horseback, moving with the ghostly silence that had made them legendary among both their enemies and allies. But these weren't hostile war parties bent on destruction. They rode with a dignity and formality that spoke of ceremony rather than combat. Samuel and Ayanna stepped outside to meet them, and Samuel felt his breath catch as he recognized the lead rider. It was Black Hawk himself, the war chief whose daughter Samuel had been protecting. The man was clearly wounded. His left arm was bound against his body with strips of hide, and Samuel could see the careful way he held himself in the saddle. But his eyes were alert and intelligent, and there was no hostility in his manner as he approached. "Samuel Crawford," Black Hawk said in careful English, his voice carrying the formal cadence of ceremony. "My daughter tells me you risked your life to save hers when the soldiers came hunting." Samuel felt suddenly self-conscious, aware that he was surrounded by nearly 200 Cheyenne warriors, all of them watching this encounter with intense interest. The fires created a circle of light that seemed to hold them all in a sacred space, separate from the ordinary world of conflict and hatred. "I did what anyone should do," Samuel said simply. Black Hawk smiled, and Samuel was struck by the dignity and warmth in the man's weathered features. "No," the chief said firmly, "not anyone. You chose to help when you could have chosen safety. You protected my child when you could have protected only yourself. You stood against soldiers of your own people to defend one of mine. This is not the action of just anyone. This is the action of a true friend to the people." The war chief dismounted carefully, favoring his wounded side. "Among my people, when someone saves a child's life, especially at great risk to themselves, they become family. You are no longer just Samuel Crawford the rancher. You are Samuel Crawford, brother to Black Hawk, protector of our children, friend to all Cheyenne." What followed was unlike anything Samuel had ever experienced. The ceremony was conducted entirely in Cheyenne, with Black Hawk speaking in the formal, rhythmic cadence of ritual, while the assembled warriors listened in respectful silence. Samuel couldn't understand the words, but he could feel the power and significance of what was happening. When the formal speeches were finished, the warriors began to approach one by one, each offering a gift and words of respect. A young brave presented him with a magnificent war shield, its surface decorated with painted symbols that told the story of great battles and brave deeds. An elder gave him a sacred pipe carved from red stone, explaining through gestures that it would ensure his words would always be heard with respect among all the tribes. The gifts kept coming. A war bonnet made from the finest eagle feathers, a rifle decorated with silver and brass inlay work, blankets woven in patterns that had been passed down through generations. Each item represented not just material value, but spiritual significance, marking Samuel as someone who had earned the highest honor the Cheyenne could bestow. But it was Ayanna's gift that moved him most deeply. She approached carrying a shirt made from the finest buckskin, decorated with quillwork and beadwork that must have taken months to complete. The design depicted a man standing between two groups of warriors, his arms raised as if holding them apart. "This is you," she explained as she presented it to him, "standing between our worlds, keeping peace where there could be war, showing that some white men still remember honor." As Samuel accepted each gift, he felt the weight of what was happening. These weren't just presents. They were symbols of acceptance, tokens of a bond that would last for life. He was being formally adopted into the Cheyenne tribe, made a brother to people who had every reason to hate and distrust all white men. "Why?" he asked Black Hawk when the gift-giving ceremony was finished. "Why take such a risk, bringing so many people here? Morrison and his soldiers could return at any time." The war chief's expression grew serious as he gestured toward the ring of fires that still burned bright in the darkness. "Because honor demands it," he said simply. "Because when someone risks everything to save our children, we do not forget. Because in these dark times, when hatred seems to poison everything it touches, we must celebrate those who choose love over fear." Black Hawk placed his good hand on Samuel's shoulder. "These fires are not for war, Samuel Crawford. They are the fires of family, the lights that guide lost children home. Tonight, you are one of those children, and we welcome you into the circle of the people." The celebration continued through the night, with songs and stories shared around the fires. Samuel found himself passed from group to group, with warriors and elders eager to meet the white man who had become their brother. Language barriers meant little. Respect and gratitude translated perfectly through gestures and expressions. As dawn approached, Black Hawk took Samuel aside for a private conversation. "There is something you must know," the chief said quietly. "The soldier chief who attacked our camp. He will not forget what happened here. He knows you helped my daughter, and he will want revenge." Samuel had been thinking the same thing. Morrison wasn't the type to forget or forgive, and Samuel's interference had probably cost the captain any chance of covering up his unauthorized massacre. There would be consequences, and they would probably be severe. "I can take care of myself," Samuel said. Black Hawk shook his head gravely. "No man should face such danger alone. From this day forward, you are under the protection of the Cheyenne people. If this soldier chief threatens you, if anyone threatens you, you send word to us. We do not abandon family." The offer was both touching and practical. Having the protection of Black Hawk's warriors would definitely make Morrison think twice about any direct action against Samuel. But it also meant that Samuel was now irrevocably tied to the Cheyenne cause, marked as a friend to people that the government considered enemies. As the sun rose and the fires were extinguished, the warriors began to fade back into the landscape as silently as they had come. But the memory of that night would remain burned into Samuel's consciousness forever. The sight of 200 fires creating a circle of light and welcome, the sound of ceremonial songs carried on the wind, the feeling of being accepted completely by people who had every reason to reject him. Black Hawk had one final gift before he departed. "My daughter wishes to stay with you for a time," he said, "not as a burden, but as a student and helper. She wants to learn more of the white man's ways, to become a bridge between our peoples like you have become. Will you teach her?" Samuel looked at Ayanna, seeing the determination and intelligence in her dark eyes. The request made perfect sense. If peace was ever going to be possible between whites and Indians, it would require people who could understand and communicate with both sides. "I'd be honored," Samuel said, and so began a partnership that would transform both their lives. Ayanna proved to be not just a quick student, but a valuable companion, helping Samuel run his ranch while serving as an unofficial ambassador between the Cheyenne and the scattered white settlements in the area. Her presence brought a warmth and purpose to his life that had been missing since Margaret's death. Morrison did indeed try to cause trouble, accusing Samuel of treason and demanding a military investigation. But by then, word of what had really happened at Black Hawk's camp had reached higher authorities. The captain found himself facing a court-martial for conducting an unauthorized attack on peaceful Indians, and his military career came to an abrupt and disgraceful end. Samuel's ranch became famous throughout the territory as a place where all people were welcome, where disputes could be settled peacefully, and where the dream of coexistence between different cultures was actually being lived out on a daily basis. Travelers would come from hundreds of miles away just to see the white rancher who had been adopted by the Cheyenne, who wore traditional clothing alongside his regular attire, and who spoke both languages with equal fluency. Years later, when Samuel was an old man and Ayanna had become a respected leader among her people, they would sometimes sit on the porch of the ranch house in the evening and watch the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. They would talk about that incredible night when 200 warriors had surrounded them with fires of welcome instead of weapons of war, about the ceremony that had transformed a simple act of compassion into a bond that would last for generations. "You changed everything," Ayanna would tell him. "Not just for me, not just for my family, but for both our peoples. You showed that it was possible to choose courage over cowardice, love over hatred, unity over division." Samuel would always protest that he had simply done what felt right, But Ayanna would shake her head with the wisdom of someone who had lived through the transformation. "No," she would say firmly, "what you did was refuse to let fear make your choices for you. When they told you to hate us, you chose friendship. When they told you to abandon me, you chose protection. When they told you to stay silent, you chose to speak for justice. Those choices, they lit fires that are still burning today." The sacred shirt that Ayanna had given him hung in his bedroom for the rest of his life, carefully preserved as a reminder of the night that had changed everything. And when visitors asked about it, about the meaning of the intricate quillwork that depicted a figure bringing peace between two warring peoples, Samuel would tell them the story of a young woman who had needed help, and an old rancher who had discovered that sometimes the greatest risks led to the greatest rewards. The story became legend among both peoples, told around campfires and kitchen tables, passed down through generations as proof that even in the darkest times, individual acts of courage could create circles of light that would spread far beyond their original source. It was a reminder that heroism often came in quiet moments, in the choice to help instead of hurt, to protect instead of profit, to build bridges instead of walls. In the end, that was Samuel's greatest legacy, not the successful ranch he had built or the cattle he had raised, but the proof he had provided that human decency could triumph over prejudice, that love could indeed conquer fear, and that one man's choice to do the right thing could literally light fires of hope that would burn for generations to come.